perceived by the grace that was given to me, they gave me the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me that we should go to the Gentiles. This is staggering. Who came down, converted Paul, and called him to be a missionary to the Gentiles? Who did that? Jesus Christ. After Easter, we're going to get back into the book of Acts and we're going to study it. Even though Jesus came down from heaven, right? He died for our sin, rose as our Savior, ascended to heaven where he rules and reigns. One day he got off his throne and came down for a short meeting with a guy named Saul. Blinded him, converted him, changed his name to Paul, said, go preach to the Gentiles. And then Jesus went back to heaven. What Paul didn't do is walk around saying, Jesus told me I get to plant a church. Jesus told me I get to write books. Jesus told me I get to preach sermons. That's what Jesus said. Here's what Paul says. I went to Jerusalem. And I sat down with James and Peter and John. And I brought Barnabas with me. And I told him, here's what Jesus has done in my life. And here's what Jesus has called me to do with the rest of my life. And I submitted it to them for spiritual authority and oversight. Those of you who feel called to ministry, those of you who feel called to leadership, particularly those of you who feel called to preaching or church planting, you are not above Paul. You have no right to just say, well, God told me and I'm going to go do it. No one had a more magnificent calling than Paul. Whatever calling you've received, I tell you this, Jesus didn't come down from heaven to convert you and to call you. And even Paul, receiving that direct calling from Jesus himself, submitted to the authority that Jesus placed over him. There is no spiritual ministry apart from spiritual authority. There's not. Paul says, I took what Jesus said and did, and I brought it to the men that Jesus appointed over me. Paul is saying, I saw James as an authority over me, and Peter an authority over me, and John an authority over me. And before I preached, and before I planted churches, and before I wrote books, I asked them, do I have your blessing? Because see, God works through spiritual authority. There's nothing more dangerous than just a renegade leader who wants to go do their own thing and say, Jesus told me, and I'm only accountable to him. It's dangerous, it's deadly, it's devastating, and sometimes damnable. Your authority, my authority, is nowhere near Paul's authority, and he submitted his authority to higher authority, and so should we. So should we. When I felt called to start Mars Hill, I went and met with elders. When I felt called into ministry, I went and met with my first pastor. I said, I think this is what God's telling me to do. He said, I think that's right, but you're nowhere near ready. It's going to be a really long time. Okay, I got a lot of work to do. When I felt called to plant, I went through a full assessment. Pastors oversaw me. A team interviewed me. A church sent me. An overseer had authority over me. The Bible talks about laying on of hands. What this is saying is that not only has God chosen this person, but he's confirmed their calling through godly leadership and authority over them. And placing a hand on somebody is demonstrating authority over somebody. And when leaders are installed in the Bible, oftentimes it's through the laying on of hands. Here's what Paul's saying. There were 6 hands on me. Can you see it? Peter put his 2 hands on me, prayed over me. James put his 2 hands on me, prayed over me. John put his 2 hands on me and prayed over me. And I'm called by Jesus, but I'm sent by these men. And I'm under the authority of these men, and I give report to these men, and I return and meet with these men, and I submit to these men. Part of Paul's greatness was the greatness of his submission. It put him in a safe place where God could use him in a big way. Do you see that? We all need that, myself included. Perhaps myself more than anyone. And it's James. I mean, have you ever thought, who did Paul's performance review? Well, that was a pretty good sermon and doing okay. And like, who does your performance review? Who's going to do Paul's performance review? James does Paul's performance review. In Jerusalem, Paul travels to James. James doesn't travel to Paul. Paul travels to James. That's convening power. That's spiritual authority. That's incredible leadership.